First theme was where we are today, where we stand, and what's our major should be. So, questions to the panelists. Number one, by when do you plan or suggest to migrate? Maybe we can start from Mike.
All right. By the way, thank you, Jay, for having us all here. We just did this IPO roadshow for BitGo in January, and it's an interesting process. And there's a whole bunch of investors that have no idea what we really do, and yet they're all asking me about quantum cryptography. I was really surprised. I mean, it was a top 3 question. It was not mine. It's on everybody's mind. So, I don't know. News cycles tend to pick up negative titles faster. To Dan's point, there's other applications that are probably should be more worried because you've got encrypted material. That could be decrypted later potentially, regardless of kind of the timeline. But nonetheless, it's a super high priority thing for the world. And so when it comes to cryptocurrencies, we trust them because we trust the cryptography. And all of a sudden, if you can't trust the cryptography, then you have to rethink everything. So people are worried about it right now. Imagine you had $1 billion. You're like, geez, the dollar doesn't look very good. Maybe I'll put it in that Bitcoin thing, but I don't understand quantum. And everybody says it's like a threat, and it's going to be here like tomorrow, and AI is going to kill all of us. So there's a lot of reasons why people are worried about it, and we got to take that out. So I agree with Dan. We should not rush it. There's a lot of competing voices about what the right answer is. But then lastly, at least for Bitcoin, it's going to take a while. So even if we had it fixed today, like the next set of issues, the more societal problems. First, you got to migrate all the wallets. So they said, what, 6 point some odd million Bitcoins
Correct.
potentially exposed. And then you got to figure out what to do with Satoshi's coins, which is kind of the existential, philosophical problem for Bitcoin. No matter what you pick is kind of ugly. So I think we got to get on it right now, at least be working on it in earnest. I think more awareness around it is super important. Everybody, here, I know has at least some interest in it. Hopefully we get a decision in terms of the protocol relatively soon so that we can get onto those other problems. But it's cryptography. You never want to rush cryptography.
What's your take, Sophie?
I don't have a mic. Oh, okay. Google has publicly announced that we are aiming for our internal migration to be done by 2029, which is based on some of the quantum research that recently came out that makes things sound a lot scarier than they used to be, different platforms scaling better and so on and so forth. I guess the question is, should you rush anything? You should definitely not rush anything. The biggest problem is, like Dan Boneh mentioned, the Sternaudy later attacks, which definitely add urgency for encryption. I would argue there is a separate problem for signatures, especially on WebPKI, which is like the thing that I'm the most familiar with and interested in, that signatures are much harder to migrate than encryption is. Encryption, you set the client to say that they would like to use MLChem. You set the server to prefer MLChem if the client offers it, and your connection is PQC. You can see that with like Chrome, Firefox, and I think some of Safari as well. I don't know if they fully rolled it out. Are asking for PQC key exchange, and various servers, in particular Google's and Cloudflare's, respond to that, and the connections are protected. You don't have to involve any CAs. These keys live for like usually seconds at best. And so this transition is much easier in a lot of ways than the signatures, where like now you have to talk about CAs. You need to, you get this problem where you're not secure until everyone is secure, because like if there are some players in the trust system that is still using old signatures, then the attacker can always say like, well, I'm this player, but I am using still the old signatures, even though there would be a PQC signature. So you need to have like various ways of like ratcheting mechanism that like tell clients which kind of keys they can trust to be PQC, which keys they should still accept for legacy reasons, and so on. So there's a lot of complexity in the signature case. I wouldn't say you should rush the signature migration, but you should like go at a consistent pace. Like the complexity of the system is just so high that waiting until you see more data does not feel responsible anymore.
Soumya.
Yeah, so in terms of, so for OpenReserve, we're a de novo federally chartered bank that's building things from scratch. So the quantum question for us is because it's a regulated bank with other people's money involved. A lot of the concerns that the BitGo has is very similar to what we're dealing with. All right, like we want to make sure that other people's money are safe and all that. That being said, we don't want to rush the transition to quantum, as Dan said. And the tricky part that I'm kind of thinking about is how do we make sure that the system design is flexible so that when a new standard is agreed upon, it's very easy for us to transition into. So I think having those like sort of like system guardrails and sort of knowing the rough shape of what that solution might look like is super helpful just from a system design point of view. But yeah, I wouldn't put a hard timeline on it.
Okay. Yeah. Over to Hart. Let's start with a couple of migration-related questions.
Yeah, so we wanted to ask you all generally about standards. So, you know, what did the standards get right? What are some issues with standards? I know, you know, dare I mention external view? You know, what do you think about the standards process?
How deeply technically do you want me to go? Because yeah, so overall, like I would say that there is a lot of stuff that the standards have learned from what we did wrong with previous cryptographic algorithms. Like I've seen way too many implementations where like people that are nowhere near the cryptographic layer are like, I don't know, looking at like the N and P and Q separately and storing it in various different formats and so on. One thing that like, for example, the standards get right is that all the keys in ciphertext and so on, they are just binary blobs. They are just defined, and that encourages anyone else to not look into how to parse them and parse them in different ways. We've seen very many vulnerabilities that just come from people parsing cryptographic elements when there was no need to do so. So that is one thing that they get right. Implementation-wise, I think there are, well, I saw a lot of Falcon on the previous slide. So Falcon aside, they're very easy to implement. Much easier than elliptic curve cryptography ever was, or RSA for that matter, to securely implement in particular. They work very well with currently existing CPU infrastructures. Like they basically are like want to use vector instructions, and CPUs have vector instructions. So they are like not as bad performance-wise as you otherwise would think they are, given the key size increases. So yeah, and then if you get into like what they did get wrong, there are too many options. External mu is one of the places where there are too many options. Well, external mu is the way that you get rid of an option. But like the fact that just if you look at the MLDSA standard, there were 6 different standards in this standard. There are 3 different sizes, and then there's a pre-hashed version and not pre-hashed version. The pre-hashed version technically isn't even a fully qualified signature scheme because it needs a hash function on top of that defined. And if you look at Dan Boneh's book, then you will see that a signature scheme does not need that usually. So like it just causes a lot of friction when there are too many options, because like, yeah, one system will do one thing, the other system does the other slightly different thing. Now these two systems cannot talk to each other. SLHDSA is, I think, the champion of too many options. I don't know how many variants of SLHDSA there are these days. Yeah, like options, especially options that aren't very meaningful, are not usually a good thing to have. I would be much happier if there were like if the options had like very different performance numbers. Like, I don't know, UV is one of the candidates, is very interesting to me because it has very small signatures that you trade off with very large public key. That is, as an implementer, a trade-off that I can make in a system. Whereas the difference between MLDSA 4.4 and 6.5, sure, is a kilobyte, but what am I trading off here? They're supposedly both secure, so why do I discuss these? Like, why do I have to care about these different schemes when they both do the same thing? Prehash is even worse, where like, well, we have a other way of doing this already. I don't have a reason to select one over the other, which just leads to more of these incompatibilities.
Actually, if I can add to that, I totally agree with everything Sophie said. There's a lot of complexity in these standards. What's interesting to me is the standards, I think, are often designed for internet use, whereas on the blockchain, there's a lot of other needs for standards to satisfy. Just to give some examples, so on the blockchain, we use a lot of HD wallets, right? So you'd like the signature scheme to support hierarchical derivation, HD. You'd like the signature scheme to support threshold signatures, because that's very common in the blockchain space. You'd like the you'd like the signature scheme to be friendly to zero knowledge proofs. We'd like to be able to do a zero knowledge proof of a signature. And in the existing signature scheme, I don't know how much of that has actually played a role. And of course, I forgot to say the most important thing, that on a blockchain, it's really important that the signature is short. Yeah, we don't want to spend a lot of time, a lot of space on signatures. And so there's a lot of requirements for blockchain-based signatures. And what we're seeing is that actually a lot of many of the projects are actually deviating away from NIST. So Sophie mentioned SLHDSA with all the options that it has. Well, it looks like Bitcoin and Ethereum are starting to coalesce around hash-based signatures, but they're not using the NIST hash-based signature. They're basically inventing their own. And in fact, I'm happy to talk about the shrimps and shrinks proposals that are being thrown around. So it's quite interesting that the blockchain community, because of the NIST issues, is kind of going down its own path of standard signatures. One more dimension that I want to mention, which I think you and I have talked about this quite a lot, which is when it comes to signatures, should you do standalone signatures or should you do hybrid signatures? And so, I don't know, maybe Sophie, you want to talk about hybrid signatures?
Okay, that's a spicy one.
Yes.
I actually am like kind of ambivalent about so for encryption, I would say do hybrid.
You should probably explain what hybrid is.
Oh yeah. So basically, what we have these classical schemes that we know have a bunch of analysis on for years, and we have these new schemes that have like comparatively less analysis on them, and like the implementations that exist have been audited and looked at to a large extent. Whereas the new stuff, they were just written. There are definitely some teasing problems that we will find, like how we do side channel protections and so on in the new things that we don't yet know fully. So the idea is, can we get both? And the answer is yes, you can get both security properties of the classical and the new algorithms, both for encryption and for signatures. For encryption, you need a key derivation function, but it's not that relevant for this discussion. For signatures, it's very, very simple. You just add 2 ampersands between your verification calls. So you just verify both of them. And if both of them are verified, then you have a hybrid. For encryption, I think hybrids are like, yeah, do them. Don't even think about it. That's like what all the browsers are doing. That's what IETF is doing and so on. Don't even, like, you don't really need to concern yourself with. The cost is fairly minimal and the benefit is clearly there. For signatures, this is a much more complicated question. Interestingly enough, not in the way that I thought it would be. Like I just explained how hybrid signatures work and how simple they are. It turns out that maybe that simplicity actually makes them more complicated because people come up with different ways of putting together two ampersands until the cows come home, which has led to a pretty large coordination headache actually with hybrid signatures, to the point that given that signatures don't have the store now, decrypt later attack, and you can technically change them if you're in a system that can change them, like if you are, like if you can revoke your signatures, which isn't always true, but if you can change signatures, and like the IATF mailing list isn't able to come up with a hybrid scheme that works for everyone, then maybe just go with pure. If you cannot change your signatures, again, the cost of doing a hybrid signature is not that high, so you should probably just do it.
Right, interesting. Actually, Dan, you answer the next question yourself. But probably to summarize, do you feel blockchain world will be a wild guys creating their own walls of signatures, not following NIST standardizations? Do you think a world like that evolving into an actual reality?
Oh yeah, I think it's pretty clear this is where we're going to go. So with
But will that demean some of the security primitives we have, or that will be done in a very informed manner?
sorry, right?
So will that demean some of the guarantees we want to have with responsibilities with NIST and others try to enforce? Because traditional finance has moved kind of full-fledged to,
Look, so
let's
some,
say,
some,
MLDS.
some blockchains adopted Falcon, some chains are adopting various versions of the MLDSA options. Ethereum and Bitcoin seem to be coalescing on the hash-based signature schemes, and they're, like I said, they're inventing their own versions. So maybe it's worthwhile. Would it be worthwhile to explain what's? I don't know. Do you guys want to hear about what's happening in hash-based signatures in the Bitcoin world? Yes. Yeah. So there's this proposal, basically that you basically can't use a hash-based signature on the blockchain because the signature is too big. So what do? You have to shrink the signature somehow. So how do you shrink the signature? Well, with hash-based signatures, we know that if you're building what's called a one-time signature, a signature that can only be used to sign one message, and then you have to change your public key, we know those signatures are not that big. Those can actually be controlled. The length can be controlled. So the idea is to basically, we're going to create two keys. One key that's going to be used as a long-term key, but you're only going to use that in case of recovery, like your wallet blows up and you need to recover your keys. You recover the long-term, the many-time signature scheme, which generates long signatures, but you only generate those long signatures on the rare event that you have to recover your wallet. And then separately, you have another signature scheme, which is only good for a small number of signatures, and as a result, it generates short signatures. So when you transact normally and you sign transactions, you're going to use the few times signature scheme, so your signatures are going to be relatively short. And when you run out of signatures in the short scheme, you just use the long-term scheme to sign a new public key. Yeah, so you kind of have these two parallel tracks, one for recovery and one for daily use. The daily use one is short, the recovery one is long. So that's kind of at a very high level the direction that the people are going in. That's not something that NIST considered. The blockchain developed this, and that seems to be like a good way to go. Now, where you get pushback is interesting is exactly when it comes to wallets. So when you look at the wallet providers, they are quite worried about hash-based signatures because generating a public key in a hash-based signature takes like a ledger wallet a couple of minutes. Generating a signature takes tens of seconds just to generate a single signature. Yeah, and so they're a little worried about where this is headed. One would expect that their microprocessor providers would add support for hashing, fast hashing into the processor, so the hardware wallets will actually be able to generate these signatures at a fast enough pace The problem is, again, we want, there's a lot of demand for these signatures to be ZK friendly, right? So you want to be able to generate a proof of knowledge of a signature. And to do that, typically you would not use the NIST standard hash functions, but rather you would use hash functions that are more friendly to ZK proofs. And those are very unlikely to be supported by the hardware. Yeah, so we're back to very slow hashing, very slow public key generation. So this is what I meant by we shouldn't be rushing these things. There's a lot of technical challenges in deciding exactly what signature standard or which signature scheme to use. You know, there are like all these problems as you think if you design these things in a room, it's actually, you know, you can design a scheme that looks perfectly fine on paper, but then you realize, oh my God, there's all the hardware wallets that have a problem with the scheme. There's all the HSMs that have a problem with the scheme. Actually, I want to give one quick example of a problem with rushing to post-quantum that I hope people remember. So this is let's just say it's a hypothetical example, but it's actually a company that came to ask me that they want to be post-quantum compliant like really fast, really soon. So what can they do? And the answer is, well, they have to adopt one of the post-quantum signature schemes. The problem is that their HSM card doesn't support a post-quantum signature. Yeah? So what do? Well, if you need to generate a post-quantum signature, but your HSM card where your keys live don't support post-quantum signatures. So what do?
Put it on a CPU.
Yeah, oh my God. Take the key out of the HSM and generate the signature outside of the HSM, right? At that point, you are far more likely to be vulnerable to a classical attacker than to a quantum computer. Yeah, so that's the sort of thing that I would say is not the right direction to go in, and that's what I mean by rushing to post-quantum. I think what I love about the Google 2029 deadline is that the right solution is you can go to your HSM provider and say, look, we have this 2029 deadline. You guys have to add post-quantum support before 2029 so we can meet our deadline. And migrate only once they add post-quantum support. Don't take your keys out of the HSM where they're much more vulnerable than they are to be stolen by a quantum computer. Yeah. So you probably have an opinion on that too.
Let's see, was that a real case where somebody took it out of the HSM?
Okay.
Okay.
I don't want to.
It sounds like a yes, but actually we had a company we worked with, a major bank, came up with the same, not even related to post-quantum. And you know, it's surprising. You know, this is why there's, I don't know, people screw up security implementations all the time. Anyone that's familiar with this knows, of course, the whole point of the HSM is to not expose the key. Why would you ever take it out? But yes, people will come up with these solutions when they're backed up against a wall.
Yeah, that's a drawback of rush.
Yeah.
Right. With that, we will move to the next theme. Over to Hart, which, brings the next question.
Yes, so I think people have been addressing this a lot already, but just talking about, 2 or 3 variables for PQ cryptography that trade against each other, and one that is non-negotiable for you all.
Yeah, this is for all of you individually. If you have to choose what you will be non-negotiable. Yep.
Speed, hardware, signature size, ZK, PC friendly, conservatism, anything you like. Agility even.
You want to start us off?
Okay, I'll start it. I mean, actually, I think for Bitcoin, the block size wars are kind of happening somewhat implicitly. You mentioned already, you know, on one hand, there's paths you could take to solve or solve the post-quantum problem. However, those are just the natural solution had massive blocks. And of course, there's a lot of people that think the massive blocks are a problem. Of course, these signatures are substantially larger, about 100x, I think, is that right? So, look, if you're only willing to have small blocks, it's going to constrain the solution that you can ultimately pick. It also is going to force you to either wait a really long time to have something that's of the right size, or you're going to have to accept a larger signature size in the end. So I'm not, Dan and Sophie are probably much better equipped to answer some of the specific differences. For me, look, I think we need to solve it in a way that's just secure, is not going to have further problems down the road. So we can't rush it. I would throw block size to the wind. I don't think that that's a real concern. I'd much rather have security where you can't lose your money.
Well, I'm mostly not responsible for blockchain-related use cases, so I'm just gonna trade all of those off. I think one thing that Dan said is like very much true. Like, yeah, if your key is currently in an HSM, it should probably remain in an HSM. Maybe you do a hybrid where the PQC part doesn't live in an HSM for now. But like, yeah, you should not like trade off quantum safety against like classical security boundaries that you have in place that are protecting you right now. At least not without like analyzing that those that is the right trade-off very, very deeply. There's a lot of cases where the trade-off is kind of between complexity and cost. Like my favorite example is Merkle tree certificates there. Like that's sort of the new shiny way of dealing with certificates, kind of similar actually to the hash-based signatures that Dan was mentioning, of like certificates are sent with every TLS connection. If you make them a lot larger, you are going to slow down the internet quite considerably. It costs a lot. But there are ways that you can make these things smaller. In the case of MTCs, the way that it works is basically the CAs basically, well, they publish a Merkle tree of all the certificates that they're currently vouching for, and then the browser vendors distribute the root of this Merkle tree to the various browsers. Then the browsers communicate to servers that they know about this root, and then the server can send a much smaller Merkle tree inclusion proof instead of sending like the certificate chain with its MLDSA signatures. That is kind of, yeah, it's very similar to the schemes that Dan mentioned, not quite the same thing, but it's also using heavily hash functions and like heavily like kind of changing the way that we distribute trust. Like it's now a much more involved system where like the browser vendors, which previously, well, yeah, they distributed the roots for the CAs, but that was kind of it. Now they need to do something on a like much more frequent scale. And you have to have a fallback mechanism in case the browser isn't up to date and so on. So you have a lot more complexity. But like for the web, at least, we decided that that is worth it because the cost of MLDSA pure would be too high. The interesting thing is that this also goes kind of closer to Dan's point that this is the right thing for web PKI. I'm not sure, or I'm fairly certain that it's not the right thing for other PKI frameworks, actually. And so you're seeing kind of divergence of ecosystems that previously used the same solutions, mostly because the solutions that we had were like ridiculously great. Like ECDSA signatures are just, yeah, 64 bytes of data and you have your signature, you don't need to worry about anything. Now you have like, now you are no longer in this world where like a signature is basically free. So now you're starting to think like, well, I could like have a hash of this thing and publish the hash somewhere there, and then that can replace it so that I get like one less signature here. And suddenly that starts making sense. Before, well, sure, technically the hash is half the size of the signature, but who cares? Now the hash is like orders of magnitude smaller, so people care. So I think that is like the biggest trade-off that I can see, a trade-off between complexity on the one hand and just eating the cost of the overhead on the other hand, which is kind of the same answer that you also gave, but yeah.
So for me, I think the most important variable is post-quantum agility. So like because we're integrating with so many different chains and so on, like each chain will kind of have their own set of trade-offs. So some chains who really care about the block size will want to make sure the the signature sites, so some chains really top performance. We really have to be able to support all of them. So making sure we can kind of adapt as new signature schemes come out and as each kind of chain works through their decisions is super, super important.
Actually, maybe I'll make a spicy take a little bit here in that, you know, there's no theorem that says that post-quantum signatures can't be less than 128 bytes. So today, it's true, ECDSA is great, BLS is great. These are wonderful signatures, lots of amazing properties, very short. The post-quantum signatures that we have today are dramatically worse. But there's no theorem that says that they have to be dramatically worse. Yeah, and it's actually likely that over time, you know, we'll come up with better and better signatures. In fact, they are improving over time. So keeping that in mind, to me, actually, post-quantum agility is quite important. You know, I actually am a little bit nervous that MLDSA is getting kind of enshrined everywhere in a way that's going to be difficult to change later on. Already, we have better algorithms than MLDSA, and it's going to be very, very difficult to move to those algorithms. So please, whatever you build, just keep in mind, there will be better signatures coming in the future. So let's not enshrine what we have today and be ready to move to something better when it's available.
Indeed. Do you like to call?
Agree. I definitely agree. Like crypto agility is always good to have. The very interesting thing is if you look at the history of things is like we had like the Merkle, like the this hash stuff first in asymmetric cryptography, and then we had RSA, and that was kind of what we stayed with. It's like in retrospect, we got incredibly lucky that the first schemes that we looked at were really good.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you want to call out a couple of alternatives of MLDSA, Dan? For better alternatives of MLDSA, which you feel will replace?
You're asking for what are better signatures?
Yeah, than MLDSA, from your perspective.
Well, okay, just if you want to stay with a family of MLDSA, just in the last crypto conference, there was a scheme that showed that you can change how MLDSA work and end up with a shorter signature, as just one example. You know, there's proposals now on ePrint for better threshold signatures from lattices. So yeah, so there's like new ideas coming up, and we just have to be open to adopting them as they become available.
Indeed. Right. Probably for Shaumya. So you have a clean sheet of paper and you're designing institutional custody, right? So you talked about post-quantum agility as one of the factor, but which one would you concede to the others? Anyone? Quick pick.
Yeah, I think, so yeah, like the variable I would anchor on is obviously post-quantum agility. For the other ones, I think, I'm trying to think which, wait, can you go back to the list? I think for us, things like on-chain affordability don't matter as much because if you're storing, say, signatures on like a private chain or in a private database, memory is cheap. Obviously, in a blockchain-based system, you have to replicate that many times, so it becomes a lot more expensive. But there are some bad benefits to kind of operating in a more centralized system.
Okay. Mike.
Well, let's see. Eliminating single points of failure is definitely a requirement. So we started out Bitcoin ECDSA, then we added P2SH, allowed multi-sig capabilities. On other chains, we don't have native multi-sig, so you end up using MPC sharding of different types. It tend to not facilitate well to cold storage, so this can make it difficult. Anyway, depending on what scheme you end up with, you're going to need something so that you don't have a single point of failure. And if you can't deal with it in various shards that are compatible with cold storage, then you probably end up with multi-signature. And if you end up with multi-signature, then the space requirement becomes doubly hard. So I know you have to solve for these problems. Putting out something that didn't have a good solution here would be an issue.
Yeah, let's move to the next theme, which actually touches how to remove single point of failure, which is MPC friendliness. You talked about multisig, that's one approach. It comes with cost and a couple of other nuances. Then other aspect is how to make the signatures threshold friendly. Just for audience, MPC is just a technique where you can create secret shares of the keys, which are never assembled in one place, and then you can perform signature as if the signature was coming from the same private key. And among all the contenders, there is a huge spectrum of possibilities that whether they can support MPC or not. And that's what we will dive in the next section. Hart.
Sure. So a question, I know Dan brought this up previously about blockchain and hash-based threshold signing that people were looking at for blockchain. So I guess we'll just ask a general question on this. We heard from Dan, and maybe we can hear some more from Dan about this. What do you all think about this? And in particular, looking at some of these hash functions that are specifically tailored toward fast ZKPs or fast MPC, like Poseidon, I believe, was already mentioned.
What? Why not? Sophie, want to say something? What? That's not my area. It's not really.
I guess you're back on the hook again.
You're on the hook, Dan.
What? Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. What is there more to say? With zero knowledge proof, you can thresholdize any signature scheme. You probably all know that, like, again, the Ethereum Foundation is planning to do aggregation across validators using zero knowledge proofs. Yeah, so we have thousands of validators who are signing individual blocks. Today, they just use BLS to aggregate all those signatures into a single signature. Breaks my heart, but BLS, unfortunately, is not quantum secure. And so we have to move to something else. And so their plan is to move to, probably they're converging on a hash-based signature, and they're going to aggregate using zero-knowledge proofs. And so you want a hash function that's going to be friendly to zero-knowledge proofs. And so let me advertise, the Ethereum Foundation started the Poseidon Challenge. This is $1 million prize to go and analyze the security of the Poseidon hash function. It's a new non-NIST hash function. It's an algebraic hash function. We've never deployed algebraic hash functions before in the real world for collision resistance. Is it secure? Is it not secure? Who knows? But there's $1 million prize to go study it. So if you guys have time this afternoon, maybe you guys want to learn a little bit about how Poseidon works. And if you can come up with a clever attack on it, there's $1 million in it for you. Yeah, so go for it. Everybody should be studying the Poseidon hash function. Who knows? Maybe Claude can help us with this. We're going to lose half our audience. Yeah, everybody's running to rush out. Yeah, so that's kind of where we are. Yeah.
So I guess I'll ask also the folks that are on the more institutional side. How do institutions feel about accepting something like Poseidon? Is this something we could convince a bank to use, or are they going to stick with things that are more traditionally standardized?
Look, I think they can barely spell Poseidon, much less understand the level of depth that we're even getting close to here. No, they're looking for things that are proven, right? I mean, when you're a fiduciary on the hook for other people's money, as mentioned, it's a different game. So it would probably mean the difference between participation and non-participation if they are not able to get their security teams through it. Yeah. So look, I don't know. This is a tough problem because it is going to come into real production environments in a very short period of time in the cryptography world, and I think a lot of traditional firms are going to struggle.
Yeah, well, one thing I will add to that is in some sense they're regulatory bodies that banks and so on have to answer to, but they are willing to listen and learn from sort of the community. So if there are better ways to do things, that can be integrated. It just can't be done unilaterally by like a bank going out on their own, because as Mike mentioned, like there are risks to just sort of YOLOing new protocols and so on.
Actually, can I make a quick plea again? I want to go back to the hybrid signature question since you brought up this issue, Mike. I want to make a plea, again, the pleas in the blockchain space when we deploy these new signatures, we deploy them in a hybrid mode, meaning that we do both ECDSA and a post-quantum signature, or BLS and a post-quantum signature. For aggregation, for example, we would do BLS aggregation along with Poseidon-based zero-knowledge aggregation. By doing that, at least we are guaranteeing that security is not going to get worse, right? The old original signature that we all know and love will keep things secure with our present understanding. Things will not get worse. If Q-Day happens, then presumably the post-quantum part will protect us. So I hope that at least we can make the argument for hybrid deployments. I like to draw this analogy. The post-quantum signatures are so big that literally, as Sophie was saying, ECDSA is really short. Really doing a post-quantum signature and putting a pre-quantum signature next to it is like taking a bus and putting a football in front of it. Yeah, it does not add that much. So you might as well do it.
Actually, towards end of the conference or the panel, we will have a demo which actually shows hybrid transactions. MLDSA plus ECDSA. Right. Sorry. Mike, you answered the question to some extent, but do you feel that when your customers come with a requirement for threshold friendliness and the chains are not supporting it as such, what will you take? Would you go to multisig, or how would you design your infrastructure?
Well, we always have taken the approach that we just have to do whatever's the most secure on whatever chain we have. So sometimes you see wallet providers, they have one key management scheme and then they deploy it on all chains as though it's equal. My own personal opinion is that if you've got multisig on a chain that's ECDSA-based signatures, you should be using multisig as opposed to using an MPC variant. So we always try to use whatever's the strongest. Obviously, the various blockchains are going to move at different speeds. They're going to have different priorities. They're going to come up with different solutions. So we're going to have to evaluate them as they come. For, I think industrial grade, institutional grade security, you just always have to solve this single point of failure problem. So if they didn't solve that, we'll have to figure out a way to devise around it. Yeah, it's going to depend on what comes.
Perfect. Indeed, yeah, we will figure out one of the methods, either MPC or multisigs, and both will coexist in that world. Right. Now the second layer of guarantees, which are HSM based. As we know, and we talked, you touched, Dan and Mike both, that we require HSMs to upgrade. And we will be touching a couple of questions on that part, what happens in post-quantum world. So yeah, Sophie, to you. Google KMS is getting lots of tractions indeed, right? So do you feel Google views of crypto agility prefer over HSMs, or software anchored migrations is a choice? So how do you take the migration for HSMs?
I would say the answer to this is it depends. It really depends on the threat model for the specific situation. Like as I said before, if you currently are using an HSM and you're using it for a good reason, then you probably want to continue using an HSM. At the same time, sometimes HSMs are not the right trust boundary, like not the right thing to do. Like if you can control physical access to a device, if you can control like other access to the device fairly well, then maybe you want to have the higher performance, maybe you need the higher performance of an online system. That is already the case. An HSM cannot do all that. Like an HSM is heavily limited in the throughput that it has. So like if you want to have a TLS server, it will not use an HSM for every single session key because the HSM would just die. It's just not fast enough for that. So really the question always has to be like, what is the threat model? What are the risks that I want to accept? What are the risks that I need to mitigate against? And depending on that, you will get to like either using an HSM, using a cloud provider, using an HSM in a cloud provider, or even like having the key right sitting there in your memory. That's certainly what Chrome does when you open a cat video, because the key is not that important.
But is KMS going to support post-quantum?
Already does.
indeed. Do you feel programmable HSMs are a path for that?
Sorry, what?
The HSMs which can be programmed, not the
Oh,
pre-baked-ins.
I don't quite know what the best answer is there. Like, there's definitely various different layers of this. Like, some HSMs, you can do a software update. Some you can't. Even when you can do a software update, it's somewhat difficult in cases. The biggest thing, like especially when you look into HSMs, the biggest thing to deal with right now is the firmware signing process, because the firmware signing keys are always by necessity in hardware. So you will never rotate those. And so those are keys where, like, I mean, my preference there is SLH DSA. Unfortunately, the NSA doesn't agree with that. Yeah, like, you want to have, at least if you have a programmable HSM that can get updates, then you need to be like, then now you have a supply chain risk. So now you need to analyze the supply chain. And the biggest thing that you need to do right now is to make sure that the firmware updates will be secure for any eventuality. That is where like hash-based signatures are very nice, because you have a security reduction. So I like them for that a lot. But yeah, like, you basically trade in like, it's another risk trade-off of, like, you have more flexibility, but you get a supply chain risk in exchange.
Also, for firmware updates, the length of the signature is massive.
Yes, the length of the signature is not that important if your firmware is a gigabyte in size. Well, usually firmware for HSMs is only megabytes, but still not that important. The speed at which the HSM does the signature verification is not that important, because you're not updating it constantly. So you can be far more relaxed with that. And a lot of HSMs these days are starting to have PQC signatures for their firmware in particular, just so that they can later patch it in for other things as well.
Mike.
Sure. So a broader question about HSMs, and I think you all just answered a lot of this, is how should they work? Are we worried about potential lock-in? I know a lot of people have discussed, like Dan, you mentioned being locked into PQC standards early. One possible way this could happen is hardware, right? We have to pick hardware now, and if we're stuck on, dilithium hardware, that could be a potential problem. And we've kind of already talked about this a lot, but does anyone want to add anything else about HSMs in a PQ world?
Well, I'll say so. I have a lot of skepticism that the HSM vendors will be able to keep up with the level of agility that's going to be needed across all of these chains. So I think BitGo, we probably ran into some of this a long time ago, combined with a second problem, which is when you think about security of digital assets and the keys being such a critical element of it, you ended up having to put some amount of policy management kind of in dedicated hardware modules as well as key. Because if all you did was have an HSM, which you can blindly sign a thing, whatever that thing is, then it just becomes a new problem of, well, who gets to control what it can sign? So you end up having to put a fair amount of logic kind of in usually a set of systems here. Anyway, I'm just skeptical that actually if you're doing broad chain support, like you're hitting the top 15, you're probably going to need a whole bunch of things, and you're probably not going to have any single HSM vendor that can keep up with whatever post-quantum solutions go into each of them. So that probably means you're going to see a lot more stuff happening outside of HSMs, or you're going to have companies that are building HSMs on their own. They're going to be using Nitro systems or other things of that in that regard. I don't know. Does anyone here have any confidence that the HSM vendors, with the speed at which they operate, is actually going to be sufficient? Maybe Google can. I don't know.
So, I mean, the problem is that the hardware lifecycle still takes several years in order to get from someone designing something to actual silicon you hold into your hand. Then you get to you need to get this silicon actually into machines. You kind of don't want to throw out your newly purchased HSM every 2 months because these things are expensive. There's certainly, like, especially when it comes to keeping up with different new algorithms, I don't see HSM vendors, especially when it comes to hardware support, be faster than they used to be. There's nothing that speeds up their process. Their process was a mostly industrial factorization process. It's not even that I don't know, AI helps with that a lot, because you still need to get the fabs to actually be HSMs. Certainly for us, we have a lot of we use a lot of different HSMs, and some of them are internally designed. And certainly those teams have been working on their designs basically since 2024 when the standards came out. And they will be actually shipping something probably in 1 to 2 years. So that is just the life cycle that you have with hardware. And they have been very diligent. They have been some of the teams that have paid the most attention to PQC, and yet they are the ones where I can brag the least about publicly of what they have actually accomplished, because a lot of these things are still TBD.
No, so yeah, that's a nice discussion on HSM, and we'll see. The space is evolving a lot, and we have seen weird stories. Right, so we have a couple of sections, but given that we started a bit late, we will skip them in the interest of time and to respect everybody's time. But before going in that, I will have one question to whole group, which is, sorry. So right now, the way at least financial institutions are working is that we are following what blockchain is doing, and blockchains are leading, and like we talked about, they are creating their own designs, which are certainly better and vetted and audited. But do you feel a consortiums of banks and custodians can lead and dictate what L1s will do? Is it possible, or that's something not possible at all? And what's the reason? Is the reason is speed, or is the reason something else?
I mean, we've all heard of bank consortiums. Probably 9 out of 10, or maybe 99 out of 100, don't materialize into a lot of fruit. So, in general, I don't think it's going to go that way. We have had on the, not related to PQ in any way. JP Morgan did their Onyx, Ethereum chain. There's been a few other attempts. They could end up creating something, and then I guess if they'd have a private permissioned ledger. But this is really more of a general blockchain debate as to what's better, a public blockchain versus private permissioned ledgers, et cetera. I don't think they're likely to lead on the cryptographic side. I think they'll look for others. Would they integrate hardware, software, technologies? Of course they would, if it works. I'm sure there will be some attempts to do some consortium-like things, but in the end, I think the open usually wins. And I think right now the blockchains are so far ahead on this front, I think in general we're going to see them on public blockchains.
One thing I will say is for banks, the goal is not necessarily to have the most secure cryptographic scheme, it's to have the most secure system as a whole. So even if banks are not leading in the introduction of new signature schemes, or leading on the standard, and we're following sort of what the L1s are doing, there still is a holistic approach here, where if something is not solved by the cryptographic scheme, there are other controls and things you can place around it to achieve the same effect from a system level. Yeah.
We also we blame the banks, but we also give the banks a pretty difficult problem, which is this regulatory burden. And the regulators have concluded that anyone that's looking for privacy must be a money launderer or a tax evader at the retail level. But when it comes to institutions, they think, oh, of course, you need to have protection for your trade so you can't get front run by your buddy over at Jane or Jump Street or whatever. Anyway, of course, we all need to have privacy, but those regulations have gotten in the way. That has caused some blockchains to get created, like Canton Network, for the specific purpose of providing privacy to institutions, as though for some reason that shouldn't apply to everybody else. So of course it should apply to everybody else. So anyway, these are non-technical issues, but our own regulations and rules do get in the way.
Indeed, yeah. So the speed matters a lot, and the way financial institutions are moving is far behind the speeds of multiple L1s around. Hart, So you lead Linux Foundation Decentralized Trust as a CTO. We would like to hear definitely from you. How do you feel the contribution of LFDT coming into picture? What role do you envision, and what's happening in post-quantum era?
Oh, well, I'm on the spot here now. I was expecting to mostly ask questions. We have lots of open source projects. They're all permissively licensed, free for everyone to use. Everything from one of the popular Ethereum clients to formally verified PQ implementations of NIST standards. So we just serve as a place where people can come together and work on open source software development. Silence has contributed, as well. I'm excited about your AP3 protocol that's coming in. Maybe you can say a little more about that if you want. But for anyone looking to collaborate on software in the open.
Yeah, LFDT has been a great partner in general to push lots of blockchain-related innovations. And yeah, AP3 is just a protocol built on A2A to begin with, which helps to orchestrate private communication between agents and to lead to collaboration, which is private, and design workflows, which are super agentic. And the goal is to make that post-quantum safe as well, using proper signature schemes and proofs. Right. So with that, I think we will hand over to Hart for any final question we have for the panelists in the interest of time. And then, yeah, we'll move to other sessions, which is a short talk and a very interesting demo.
Great. Well, I'll just ask a quick question then. Everyone has talked about a lot of stuff today. For each of the panelists, if you think that there's one thing we should pay attention to and follow in the future, what do you think it is around PQ and PQ deployments?
I guess.
Yeah, for me, for PQ deployments, like the important thing, as I kind of mentioned, was the agility aspect. I think there's like PQ signature schemes, like there's probably a lot of innovation left ahead, and I'm sure as the signatures get better and better, we'll be able to simplify a lot of the other parts of our design while maintaining the same level of security. So I think, to me, like I look at it from like a very holistic system view. So that's kind of what I look for.
I guess you mentioned agility, so I don't know what else I should say. I don't know. Crypto agility in general is a pretty good idea, so let's leave it as that.
Well, let's see. I think just 6 months ago, I think there was not enough attention on this problem. It does seem like it's ratcheted up, so I'm glad for that. I do agree we shouldn't move too fast, but I do think we need all of the right minds thinking about it as well. We can't move too slowly. It's going to catch up with us sooner than we think. So
Maybe the point I'll make is that this technology, the quantum threat, is not a threat to the blockchain. We know what to do. We know how to update the chain. The blockchains will survive this transition. There's a lot of policy and debates that have to happen to decide exactly where to go. But there's no doubt the chains will survive this transition, and we will move to a world where we have post-quantum blockchains. I just want everybody to take that message away, in that quantum is not going to be in any way a long-term threat to the blockchains.
Awesome, thanks. You'll have to change that when you come up with a quantum algorithm for LWE.
Right, so that concludes our panel discussion, and we should thank a lot to our panelists for engaging discussions, showing lights. Would you open for some questions, or should we go ahead in the next session?
So in terms of the HSM and the limitations of the HSM that Sophie and Dan pointed out, do you think programmable HSM by this vendor called Crypto4A would be helpful? That could actually, they're a Canadian vendor, Crypto4A, and they're building custom HSM modules. programmable HSM as well. Would that accelerate the adoption of MLDSA, MLKMM, and other things? Because that was one of the points that you discussed, right? Today, the HSM vendors are lagging behind.
I think Sophie knows more about HSMs than I do. So
I mean, I know of Cryptography, and I mean, it's certainly, like, I do think that certainly helps, yes. If you have HSMs that can do MLDSA, you have an HSM that can do MLDSA.